morning, everyone, and welcome to Mourning Coffee. I am your host, Brooke Carlock. We are live right now on Facebook and YouTube and LinkedIn. So I would love it if you could join us and comment with your questions and comments for me and my guest today. And speaking of this guest, I am so freaking excited because the guest today is someone that I personally utilized her book and her podcast while I was grieving the loss of Libby enough that I actually wrote her into my book and mentioned her stuff in my own book. So I am totally fangirling today over my guest. So we have Shelby Forsythia with us today. She is an author of 2 amazing books about grief. She is a grief guide or grief support person, a coach. She is also a podcaster, and she's had, I think, 3 different podcasts that are all fantastic. So I am so excited to speak with her today. So I'm going to welcome Shelby to the stage. Hello, Shelby.
Hi, everybody. I'm really, really glad to be here today.
Yeah, I am. I've been so excited for this interview because, like I said, I have been a fan of yours for a long time. And I can't remember if I've told you this. I think I have. But when I lost my daughter, Libby, so I had just lost my dad and my stepmom, and my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and then Libby died. And all of that had happened within a few months. And I was, as you can imagine, was a complete disaster. And I'm very open with the fact that I had a point where I was thinking about suicide. I almost walked out in front of a truck at the accident site where Libby was. And at that point, I decided to check myself into like a local day program at a mental health hospital here in my area. And every single day that I would drive to that program, I listened to Grief Seeds, and Grief Seeds kept me going. It just has such a special place in my heart because your voice was so soothing and so kind, and everything that you said was so helpful that it was just like those drives helped calm me down and honestly helped me survive that darkest period of my life. So personally for me, thank you for everything that you do. But yeah, if you could just, I guess, start off with whatever you are drinking, and then we'll get into kind of your background and your story so my audience can get to know you.
I love it. Well, and thank you for that. I'll tell you one of the funniest stories one of the funniest real life things that's happened to me was I presented as part of a grief bereavement cruise in 2019, and this woman came up to me, and I'd never met her before, and she'd never met me. And the first thing out of her mouth was, "I hope I don't offend you." And I was like, "Oh my God, what are you going to say next?" Because if you met me on the internet, you could literally say anything about me, and I would have no idea how you came into my circle. And she said, "I hope this doesn't offend you, but every single night before I go to sleep, I put on one of your podcasts, and that's the only way I'm able to sleep. So I don't actually listen to what you have to say, but your voice puts me to sleep." And over the years, I've had so many people comment things like, "This is so soothing. This is the only thing that feels comforting right now." And just kind of this sense of, even if the words aren't going all the way in, the sense that somebody is speaking to you in grief is really important. And I create so many podcasts and write so many books because I wanted that sensation for myself as well. I wanted that to be true. And so I really, I am so honored to have invisibly just held you in that space of audio ears and wrapping around. And God knows, for me, after my mom died, I couldn't read. And so podcasts were the only place I could get information without it feeling too overwhelming. So suffice it to say, who the heck am I? I'm Shelby Forsythia. I'm an author of 2 books. Your Grief, Your Way is my second one. I brought it here in case we want to read today's devotional passage. It's a non-religious devotional for grief. So many devotionals for grief talk about God and Jesus and the role of spirituality in grief. And especially for me, again, after my mom died, I was like, God is a mean person. If God was a nice person, he would have let my mother live. And my relationship to faith and beyond was so just tangled up in so many ways that I didn't want to have anything to do with God. And so Penguin Random House approached me to write this book, and they're like, "We get this feedback from grieving people that they want something for grief, but they don't want it to have to be spiritual." And so this is very practical, boots on the ground. Here's the things you can do every day to make living with life after someone dies a little bit more bearable.
Yeah.
And it was really an honor to write. I'm working on my third book right now, which I won't say too much about because it's still very much under production, but it's coming out next spring. And I'm the founder of an online course called Life After Loss Academy. And this is it's a course, it's a community that's year round, open to anybody. Once you're in it forever. It's not like a grief support group that ends after 6 or 8 weeks. And I help people build lives that they actually love
Mhm.
from the lives that loss forced them to live. And this can be death related loss, but it can also be divorce, breakup, major diagnosis,
Yeah.
pardon me, job loss, pandemic grief, simply being alive in 2025. Like
Yeah.
that
With the dumpster fire that is our world. Yeah.
dumpster fire that we're enduring right now,
Mhm.
and it's just and we go live in that group every Thursday for really similar conversations to this one where I take questions and guide people through whatever they're facing in their grief, and some people are 3 months out from a loss, some people are 10 years out from a loss, but the
Yeah.
one thing that they all have in common is I don't want to get over my grief. Society keeps telling me to get over it. People in my life tell me, "Am I over it yet?" or "Just let it go," blah blah blah, and they're like, "I don't wanna get over it. I know there's a way to live with it, but I don't know
Yeah.
how." And so this course is literally like the roadmap of here's how to get there, but how to customize it in a way that works for you. And then on a personal level, my mom died, as I've referenced to, in 2013 pretty suddenly from breast cancer. I was a senior in college at the time.
Mhm.
And I often compare it to like those old cartoons on TV where somebody would fall from like a high story building and then they'd rip through an awning and then rip through a awning and then rip through a laundry clothesline and then
Yeah.
finally land in the fruit seller's cart or something like that. But there were so many layers to my grief. And so I didn't just lose my mother, I lost hope of reconciliation with her because she and I were fighting
Mhm.
when she died. I lost my faith and growing up in a Christian household and feeling like God was anything I wanted. I lost my sense of home on earth. I lost this kind of compass of like who I was in my family and who I was as a daughter, and I lost the dream of a future where she would be present.
Yeah.
And that's just a handful of things, but it felt like a world's worst layer cake
Yeah.
of losses altogether. And then more recently, and also pretty suddenly and tragically, my best friend died from COVID in 2022.
Mhm.
She presumably got the virus from safely masking and going out to a brunch with friends, and she was gone within about 2 weeks. And then my cat died last year.
Mhm.
And those are just death losses. I've also experienced the breakup of an engagement, moving across the country multiple times, job loss from COVID and beyond, and just like all these other and a chronic illness diagnosis. And so I kind of look at grief as this thing that is not just death and is not just the one-time thing, but something that happens in a lot of forms all the time. And if you really want to go there, if you really want to go deep, I often consider grief as a part of the everyday. So, like when your head hits the pillow at night, you are grieving the loss of another day, whether
Mm.
or not you recognize it, and whether or not you
Yeah.
put time and energy towards grieving that thing. But we're losing things all the time, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that's happening. And I think because grief is so often intertwined with death, we see it as a bad thing. Um,
Yeah.
but it is
I
happening
love
all the
that.
time.
I remember one of the things that I admire about your work is that as someone who's been following you for a while now, I feel like I've watched you go through a lot of those things that you talked about. So I
Mhm.
remember, your friend dying. I remember hearing about all of that kind of in real time, which is such like a vulnerable place for you to put yourself where people can watch you. It kind of started with your mom, but then as you've experienced things, you've shared them. Is there like how do you
Mhm.
decide what to share and how
Mhm.
vulnerable to be like with your audience?
Yeah. There's a common wisdom that says, "Write from your scars, not your wounds,"
Mm.
and I throw it out the window. Um, for better or for worse. I mean, there's a few things I don't talk about online. The things I don't talk about would be things that, to my imagination or to my mind, may hurt other people if they came
Mhm.
to light, people that I'm not interested in hurting. And I'm estranged from a few family members. I don't super talk a lot about that online. But things that have happened and have happened to me and through me, generally those things I feel really comfortable talking about online,
Mhm.
especially if it's my perspective of my friend's loss or my perspective of my cat's loss or my perspective of my mom's death or crappy things that people said to me after my
Yeah.
mom died, or insensitive things I heard from the internet after, this other loss happened, or people thinking that environmental grief isn't real or that COVID grief doesn't still linger for a lot of people. So responding to the things people say online is something I'm actually really comfortable with. And then there are other things that are kind of just like street smarts. Like I don't disclose where I am
Right.
live most of the time. People know I'm in Chicago, but Chicago is blessedly a very big city, so
Very
I'm
large.
very hard to find. The only time I met a podcast listener in real life who did not know where I was at the time was on a merry-go-round in Victoria, BC, in Canada. I was with
Wow.
my wife at a garden, and we were
Yeah.
going around and around. And I was like, I want to be a kid again. I want to ride the merry-go-round like I'm 5. And and this person was, like, calling my name from outside the gate that surrounds the merry-go-round, and I get off, and she was like, "Shelby Forsythia?" And I was like, "Oh my god, this is the craziest thing that's ever happened." And she was like, "My daughter has been listening to your work forever and ever, and I follow you on Patreon and on your podcasts and
Yeah.
stuff," and she was a follower of mine on Facebook, and so we took a picture together, it was really fun. But for the most part, I don't tell people where I am, and there's a lot of things about who my closest friends are and who I'm in relationship with that I keep kind of close to my chest.
Yeah.
Partially because I'm a queer person in the United States and it's becoming less and less safe by the day,
Mm.
and partially because my friends' stories, aside from how they intersect from mine, are not mine to tell.
Yeah.
And so, other than that, it's kind of all bets are off.
Yeah.
Unlike a lot of people, I love talking from the rawness of grief. I don't necessarily wait for things to heal, heavy air quotes,
Right.
before sharing them. I'm not always in a place of despair, but a lot of times I am in a place with a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And I think that resonates with a lot of people who are grieving because especially if you're really deep in a season of despair, no matter how long it's been since the loss, um, I think it helps to know that there are other people out there asking these same questions and that you're not
Right.
um, insane or crazy or losing your mind for having the same questions or having a similar experience. And that's something I really do like to do. And the other thing, I'll say this one last thing. The other thing I like to share is every time I have a grief dream,
Yeah.
because this is such an unspoken part of life after loss, is dreaming of people who have died or dreaming of pets who have died. And I have had the gift and the curse of having lots of dreams and nightmares about the people and pets in my life who've died
Yeah.
and interacting with them and how they come to me and what they say and how that helps me or hurts me. It's something that's not often talked about in the grief community. I know of one person who literally has a PhD in grief dreams,
Wow.
and thus far it's not really studied. And
Yeah.
so to share specifically those experiences, is something I really, really, really intentionally do in the moment. Like the morning after I wake up, if I have a grief dream, y'all are gonna hear about
You'll
it.
share it, yeah. Well, I love it because I've heard some of those and yeah, I think your vulnerability and just kind of realness and rawness was what drew me to you in the first place, and it was I honestly, that's how a lot of people found me as well because I mean, I started blogging almost immediately after my daughter died just as a way to survive for myself because I was a writer and
Yeah,
that's what I did. And I didn't want to talk to people. I just wanted to write. And just being so vulnerable and honest, I found so many people that responded to that and just said, thank you. Thank you for telling it like it is and not sugarcoating anything and, admitting you have no idea what you're doing, right now. And I think people really respond to that. And I think that was one of the reasons that I responded to your work as well. So I appreciate that. And I feel like
yeah,
I mean, I do enjoy the fact because I mostly stick to death kind of grief just because of all my personal losses deal with that. But often when I watch you and I know you're like very political and I appreciate that because that takes a certain amount of bravery in our culture today. And I appreciate that so much because I often feel like do you feel like that's part of your grief? And you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. But in our culture today, do you feel like being a queer person is something that you kind of grieve the state of our society and how comfortable and safe you feel?
yeah. Well, yes. So blanket yes to that.
Mm.
And it also is reminiscent of, and I'm not the best history buff, I do try. But oftentimes when the people in the highest positions in society come for one group of people, it indicates that they're willing to come for anybody.
Mhm.
And so especially during the Holocaust, for as much as Jewish people were targeted, and they were, queer people were also targeted as a
Yes.
minority not worth existing in the world. And so to know right now that trans people and queer people like myself are not um, wanted in the world,
Mhm.
in so many words, by a large faction of the population, and especially vividly by those in the highest power, is grief worthy. But I'll also say, beyond my own personal identity and beyond queerness, grief is political, just period. If funding for cancer treatment had gone differently, I may not have lost my mother. I may know more about hospice care. My father may have gotten more time off of work to grieve. Bereavement
Mhm.
policy, it's very political. If the person who was president at the time that my best friend died had been different, or the policies around restrictions and seeing each other around COVID had not been lifted as early as they were, or if vaccines had come out sooner, or vaccine propaganda was different, my friend may not have died.
Yeah.
Like there are so many things that not only inform how we move through the world as individuals, but how we live and how we die, and then consequently how we grieve. One of my favorite grief organizations, I'm not paid to endorse them at all, is called Evermore, and they
Mhm.
advocate for bereavement leave and family paid leave policies in the United
Yep.
States because 3 days is not enough, and
Nope.
especially 3 days
Agreed.
following the loss. I'm like, what I would have
Yeah.
given for a week, 6 months after my mom died,
Yeah.
or a sabbatical of some sort, like a year or two after she died. But we don't get those things because they're not hardwired in, and when they're not hardwired in, they're not, like, the basis of how we live,
Yeah.
and when they're not the basis, everybody else is like, "Well, it's a free-for-all." So bereavement policy, kind of like maternity leave right now, is like, well, that's a nice bonus if you can get it where you work,
Yep,
but if you can't
exactly.
get it where you work, then sucks to be you. Like,
Yeah.
and such a that is also a political thing. So
Mhm.
there's very fair question for you to ask. There's what is loud right now, but then there is how grief is always present in
Yeah.
politics. Who is more likely to be targeted by police? Who is more likely to be able to afford a house? Who is more likely to be working blue collar, white collar, and service jobs? Like who
Yeah.
is how are we structuring ourselves? All of that is political, but all of that is also embedded with grief. And so
Yeah.
I kind of in Life After Loss Academy, my students and I talk about wearing grief glasses. And after a loss happens, you see grief everywhere, whether you're watching on
Yes,
TV,
we do.
in books, you and it's so kind of like it's like playing grief I Spy out in the world, and you're like, oh, that memorial bench in the park, it's not just a bench with a plaque on it, that's a grief event that
Mhm.
happened. Or that character in that show who's experiencing a loss, that's a grief event. Or that person that I know who just lost their job and isn't sure where to turn next, that's also a grief event. And so you kind of see it folded into everything. And so for me, the grief glasses are super glued to my face. There's no way to
Yeah.
take once the loss happens, you can't unsee the grief. And now I just see grief folded into everything. Some people would think that's exhausting, I think, but for me, it feels a lot more human and a lot more inclusive to, like, tell the truth of where the grief is present in every single room.
Yeah,
I'm
definitely.
really fun at parties.
Same, I get it. I get it. Well, I do. I say all the time, I never realized until my daughter died in a car accident. I never paid attention to car accidents, and I swear to God, it's like every 30 minutes there's another car accident
Yep.
that pops up on my, news feed, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, yeah, it's amazing what you start to notice." I feel like we could go down a gigantic I can make a whole other podcast about all the stuff that you said about, about our world and the different ways that we
Mhm.
could look at it as grief. But um, one of the things that you do talk about a lot that always resonates so much with me is how grief isn't just pain, it also has a way of revealing our values and what matters
Yes.
most to us. So I was wondering if you could talk
Mhm.
about that a little bit because every time
Mhm.
you bring that topic up, I'm like, yes.
This is one of my favorite thank you for bringing this up. This is one of my
Yeah.
all-time favorite tools for grief because a lot of people, including myself, especially after my mom died, looked at grief and said, "This just feels bad. This
Mhm.
just feels like crap all the time." And I don't understand and can't see and can't comprehend how this could possibly I don't know a better way to phrase it, but, like, be good for me
Right.
or help me or see a way through it. And I learned this. Full credit is due to Gabrielle Valdez. She's a relationship and dating
Mm.
coach. She's no longer in practice, but she came on my podcast coming back, I think, way back in 2017, 2018. And she talked about, she did it through the lens of dating and relationships, and then I stole it and use it for grief. But she talks about often the things that break your heart are giant, giant fingers pointing at your highest values.
Mm.
And so if the biggest thing that you're grieving is not getting to say goodbye to somebody in their final moments, the other side of that is that you deeply value communication and saying what's on your heart and connecting to the people that you love. And
Yeah.
that may not seem like very much, but that's actually a lot. And her example that she often gave, if you grieve um, being cheated on in a relationship or infidelity in a relationship, the other side of that is that you value fidelity and open communication and honesty and loyalty and all these other big, huge, lovely things that it is worthy to build a life around.
Right.
And when I do this exercise with people, they're like, "Okay, great. I know what my values are, but now what do I do with them? So what? What do I do?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And the purpose of this exercise is not just to say there's another side to this, or here's the dark, hard stuff that you've been seeing till now, and then here's the other stuff, and they can all sit together. But with that information now, you can say, okay, how can I continue to live into those values, even if my person's not here, even if the relationship is over, even if my health or my diagnosis has changed? How do I take these things that I know for sure about myself and actually build a life around that? How do I let
Yeah.
my grief in a way, be a sort of teacher or a different lens of seeing what I value and what I can move forward with. Um, and these things don't come to you all at once. That's a big star asterisk disclaimer I give people right away is you will not know all of your griefs and all your values in the
Right.
moment of your loss. This is a separate topic, but this is what I taught on during the bereavement cruises is in terms of secondary losses, there are three different kinds. There are immediate ones, there are delayed ones that you only find out about later, and then there's surprise ones that you never saw coming.
Yeah.
So you could in the immediate wake of my mother's death, I lost access to her physical body forever. That's a big loss. Delayed loss was kind of this sense of home and the family historian, and she had the
Mhm.
scrapbooks and the stories and all this stuff. And after about 6 months to a year after her death, I was like, "Oh, the person with the stories died." And that was something I knew I would grieve, but I didn't know in what way, so that was kind of a delayed loss. And then, surprise losses are, like, the things you don't expect, like, "Oh my god, I'm in the cereal aisle, and there's" I don't remember her favorite cereal in this moment. Here's a better example, green tea was her big thing. Oh, that's also
Uh-huh.
what I'm drinking this morning is green
Oh,
tea
all right. Green
in
tea.
honor of my mother. Um, but I would see boxes of green tea, which was, like, her favorite thing, and she'd just water it down and drink it all day, and I'm like, "I don't have to buy this anymore."
Yeah.
I don't need this in my house anymore. I as a college student, I didn't super love it. Um, but just having kind of a grief meltdown, an unexpected what's your grief calls it a grief bomb
Yep.
over something you never expected to lose or is a sort of surprise loss that comes with the other loss. It's like, crap, I didn't expect to have to grieve that.
Yeah.
And so in those moments, you will discover what you're grieving, but also can have the opportunity to be like, what's on the other side of that? What's something that you value that may be also showing up in this moment, but through the doorway of grief?
Yeah, I love that. I call them grief tsunamis in my book, and the grocery
Yeah.
store is such a huge trigger for so many people. Um, and it's funny that you mentioned, like, being in the cereal aisle because it was I remember for my daughter, like, being a mom, like, I did all the shopping for the kids.
Yeah.
So it was I still, 3 years out now, I cannot go through the grocery store without constantly seeing things that I normally would have bought for her, but to kind of bring it back to your point, I kind of connect that to one of those huge values that I lost being the loss of myself as a mom, like the person
Yes.
who makes I grieve this constantly. I am currently really grieving this now because my sons are, they're grown, they're out of the house. So and now I live in a tiny house. And I used to do all the big family dinners and we'd all sit down together and I can't do that here. There's not enough space and they're not living with
Mhm.
me anymore. And I miss that so much that the longer I go without
Mhm.
it, I realize that's one of my values. I love being that person. I wanted to be the mom and then the grandma that everybody came over, for the
Like the
family
central
dinners.
hub,
Yes,
like
yeah,
the
like
home
I
base for the
I
family.
yeah, like I want to be that person and it is so hard adjusting to the fact that that I can't do that right now. Maybe someday I'll have a bigger
Mhm.
house and, they'll have their own families and we can start to do that. But I am really missing that right now. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's the negatives to it, but then there's also the positives where, I say like after my daughter died and everybody, so many people in my family died. I don't know if you found it the same way where it did allow me to stop caring about what people thought and to focus more on what I actually wanted and needed. Like after Libby died, I was in a bad marriage when she died. It was my second marriage and I ended that. It was like I
Yep.
was trying so hard to hold on to it. And then as soon as she died, I was like, I'm done. Like why am I spending so much exhausting energy trying to keep this working when it's not what I want, and it was so much easier to just be like, nope, I'm done. Like it's not good for me. I'm done.
Yeah.
And it's been like that, and I look at that
Mhm.
so many times people think there aren't positives in a deep loss. But if you really think about it, I think eventually, maybe not right away, you can find a positive in becoming more yourself, I think. So I don't know if you experienced that
Yeah.
at all, but
Yeah, I'll tell you, for me, it kind of expedited the sense of, "Oh, I'm an adult and I'm in charge here," sense,
yeah.
because I didn't have, like, a spiritually, I still believe I have, like, a mother looking over me, but,
Mhm.
um, certainly not in real life, and certainly not from other family members in the way that a mother would. So, from a from a larger, kind of more existential perspective, yeah, I moved. I, like, got my first apartment. I, like, got a job. I mean, like, did all these things without, like, the consult or the wisdom of a mother, and then, like, on a very, I don't even know how to say this, but on a very shallow level, I got a tattoo a lot faster than I would have if she were alive. I got my first tattoo, I still don't regret it, and it's something I wanted to do, but it's something that I kind of felt free to do because she wasn't there to criticize me or have, an opinion that was
Thank
actually
you.
judgment, but so it's
Yeah.
one of those things where it's like, at 21 years old, I'm like, "Oh my god, I'm in charge of my own life," and I think a lot of people come to that discovery maybe when they get off their parents' insurance in the United States, or maybe
Mhm.
when they get their own house or a big girl job or whatever, whatever milestones or landmarks, or maybe when they get married or move out of their house or whatever the case may be. But for me in grief, it certainly expedited that process a lot faster of like, oh, I'm on one hand, I'm all alone here, but on another hand, I'm in charge. And so again, there's that
Yeah.
two-sidedness of the coin of like, I am doing this all by myself, but I am doing this all by myself. And
Yeah.
there's a despair and a pride in that, and they both kind of seesaw, and the levels are different every single day. I'm like, sometimes I'm so
Yeah.
glad to be like, I'm running my destiny, I'm in charge of this, and everything I've made in my life, and this is a massive privilege to say, but is a choice I have brought into my life, or I've said yes to, or I've consented to in some way to be in existence with me. I understand
Right.
that being in space and time with people is a privilege because death really makes you see that.
Yep,
And
it does.
and it's a massive privilege to be able to say that, and also, there is a great, like, an agony and a pain that still exists of, like, "And my mom's dead, and my friend's dead, and my cat's dead." In Life After Loss Academy, we talk about it as this record player that's just kind of always on in the
Mm.
background, and sometimes it's louder and sometimes it's softer, but it's this, "And my mom's dead, and my mom's dead, and my mom's dead, and my mom's dead."
Yep.
It's like a skipping player, if people still know what record players are.
Yeah.
Um But, like, "And my friend's dead, and my friend's dead, and my cat's dead, and my cat's dead, and my marriage didn't work out, my marriage didn't work out, my marriage did," it's just like, what are
Yeah.
the things that continue to play underneath everything, and they're not all bad, they're just all true.
Yeah.
And that's something I talk about so much in grief is the presence of grief in and of itself is not bad, it's just true, and so how do you expand your life to make room for it? But, yeah,
Yeah.
I love that sense of there are some things that you can be grateful for while also wishing the loss never happened,
Yeah.
because you would do anything to undo it. And also, you're not mad about who you are now or what your life is made up of now.
Yeah. I love that metaphor of the record player. That is
Mhm.
perfect. It is. It's like my daughter died. My
Why,
daughter
thank you.
died. Now that I think about it, I'm like, that is perfect because it's kind of constantly playing there. And I can't imagine, like, I'm listening to you talk about, and you lost your mom when you were, so relatively young, and it's still, I mean,
It seems younger the older I get. I'm like, "Wait a minute."
yeah, yeah. I mean, I was in my
Hey.
40s, and I lost both of my parents, And it was still, I still have those moments where, I totally had my own life going on, but then I still have so many times where I'm like, I go to call my dad and it's like, oh, I can't call my
Mhm.
dad. Like, I still miss that person. Like, the holidays, we lost the holiday traditions because now there's no one's house to go to. And yeah, so I can imagine that was pretty overwhelming being, even younger, kind of losing that sense of, I don't know, security or,
Yeah.
but yeah, oh my goodness.
The biggest word, my clients and come to me with, and the biggest word that I had for myself was lost. And I
Mm,
think a lot of people, especially from the outside looking in, they think grief, they think sad. And I'm like,
yeah,
yeah, but it's more than that. And for me and for so many people I work with and who come to Life After Loss Academy and engage with my podcast and read my books and stuff, they're like, I'm not just sad. I feel so disoriented, like
yeah,
the falling through layers metaphor of like the ground went down underneath me, but then the floor and then the foundation of the house and then the center of the earth. Like I don't know where I am in time and
yeah,
space. And that is often a greater crisis to people. And it certainly was to me than being sad. They're like, I can deal with sad.
right,
But this sense of I don't know where I'm going, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know who I am anymore because loss took parts of who I
yeah,
was and permanently, and I cannot get them back. And I also don't know where to go from here because everything looks like a life without them or a life
mm,
without this relationship or this thing or this dream that I wanted. And so loss is such a huge, again, kind of like an unspoken element of grief is like we're talking around it, but we're not necessarily using that word to describe what we feel. And so when I sit down with people, I'm like, kind of like being lost or like disoriented or discombobulated. And they're like,
yeah,
yes. And I'm like,
yeah,
okay, so now that's the place we're moving forward from. It's not sad. And you're allowed to be sad. But the greater thing I think so many people are struggling with is I don't understand the landscape of where I am. I resent being here and the energy it
right,
takes to be here and to figure this out. Um, and also, I don't know where to go from here. There's at the
yeah,
same time, there's a lot of options and none at all. And it's very, very,
true.
it's a really hard place to be.
Yeah, that identity loss is so huge, and I know one of the other things that you bring up a lot is, along with the identity loss, the loss of relationships and just
Mhm.
the disorientation of knowing who your people are now. Like, who can be there for you, people who you thought would be there for you who are not. So many changes in relationships. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit? Because I know that that's a topic you're pretty passionate about.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites, and I think I'm going to lead a workshop on this
Mm.
in May. So if you want to sign up for my email list, you can go to shelbyforsythia.com and there should be a little pop up. And you can sign up and be notified when it comes around again. But one of my favorite things to talk about and teach on, I taught it 6 times in 2024
Wow.
because it seems really relevant right now,
Yeah.
is how to negotiate friendships after
Mm.
loss. And I created this kind of silly but very helpful framework for determining how exactly your friends and family and coworkers are causing you pain and grief. It's called the 11 toxic grief tropes.
Oh,
And I won't list all of them here for you, but
okay.
there's like the rose colored reframer who always wants you to see the bright side. It's like, look on the bright side. At least you got to say goodbye. They're always watching over you. God doesn't close another door without opening a window, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
There's the judgmental jerk whose only question is, aren't you over it yet? Why are you still crying? Haven't you moved on? They're just judging you and your progress the whole time.
Yep.
There's one of my least favorite ones. They're kind of all my least favorite, but one of my least favorites is the obnoxious one-upper who's like, "You think that's bad? I had to grieve uphill in the snow both ways during a war and a blah, 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 blah," and they just wanna compare their loss to yours. And the one that is the most common that I see with my clients and students who join Life After Loss Academy is the disappointing disappearer. So
Mm,
somebody who maybe shows up in the initial first days after a loss and then just ghosts into oblivion. They do
yeah.
not exist anymore. I worked with a client once whose mother died, and she said, "My best friend of 20 years came to the funeral, and I never saw her again."
Oh my god.
And she's like, "I've texted, I've reached out, I see her on social media, I dropped a letter in her mailbox for goodness sake, like, we're writing snail mail in this the year of our Lord, 2025." And she's like, "I don't know what I did. I don't know what happened. I don't know if she's afraid of me. I don't know if she's afraid that now her mom's gonna die and I'm gonna bring a curse upon her," which is
Mm,
very common for, divorce losses as well, as, like, if one person in a friend group gets divorced, then everybody else is
and
afraid
they
that it
all
could
do.
happen to them. Yes, absolutely. So
Yeah.
she's like, "I don't know what she's afraid of." She didn't move away. It was very confusing and disorienting, and to your point, those become other things that we must grieve. And so in this workshop at In Life After Loss Academy, also we talk about not only how do you classify which toxic grief trope, one or more, that a friend or a family member is being in your direction in grief, but also how to script out and write boundaries to say, I'm hurting because of this specific thing you did. Could you change your language or could you change your behavior because I love you and I still want to be in some sort of relationship with you? Or
Yeah.
at work because I enjoy working with you and I want to continue collaborating together. You might not say I love you to your coworker. Um, do you think that's a possibility? And then the last thing we do, because we must do this when we're grieving, is create kind of what if plans. What if they respond well? What if they respond poorly? What are you going to do? Because you do have some
Yeah.
power and autonomy here. And what if they don't respond at all? Especially for disappointing disappearers. And so we create almost like a little game plan of how to request things from people who are actively feeling hurtful to us, and then what to do if it goes well, if it goes poorly, or if it doesn't go at all,
Mhm.
for some sort of disappearance. And relationships are a lot more fluid and sticky than that. I know I'm walking through it as a clear framework, but what we do in Life After Loss Academy is talk about all the ways friends and family members are responding and things you might stay instead, or how to approach them at a time of day or in a season of their life where maybe they're not as stressed. It shouldn't be on you, the griever, to do
Right.
that, but considering
Yeah.
where people do they have a test coming up? Are they getting married soon? Blah, blah, blah. And so just consider, are they morning person or night person? Do they prefer text or email or talking on the phone? Like there's so many things to consider when setting boundaries and asking for new things in relationships, but something I affirm for every single client I work with and every student in Life After Loss Academy is grief non-negotiably changes the rules of engagement in
Mm.
every relationship you hold in your life. So it's not your fault that
Yeah.
you need to like request a software update basically. You need to negotiate the terms of how you are in relationship to people in your life, even if it's just temporarily. And this is another one of the tools we talk about in Life After Loss Academy, but saying something like, would it be okay if right now, in this season, for the time being, we met for coffee instead of going to a loud restaurant? My nervous system just can't handle it.
Yeah.
But even when setting boundaries that people are asking things of them, um, right now, it helps a lot to hear my mom's name. Could you make sure to bring her up once or twice? Or right now, I don't have the strength or the memory to reach out to people. Can you text me every Friday? Sometimes I'll text back, sometimes I won't.
Yeah.
But I'd really appreciate you taking the lead for the next, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, however long for you. But even just giving a tiny bit of power back to grieving people at a season when they feel like I don't have any, and also comes with this fear of, well, if my friends don't take it well, they might leave, or I
Yeah.
might have to find a new job, or I might have to move out of my house with my family if things get bad enough. Giving them that sense of power back, and there are things you can do to ask for what you need, and it's okay that things have changed, is really really powerful. Again, in a
Yeah.
season where grieving people feel as if they don't have any.
Yeah, I mean, that workshop sounds so helpful. I love the names, but and
Me too. I was like, I got to make it funnier. It's not worth it.
yeah, my favorite, it was funny, my therapist actually threw I was talking about some of the people during one of my sessions, and she was like, "Oh, that person's a grief whore." And it just sounded so funny coming from a therapist, and I was like, "A grief whore?" She's like, "Yeah, I call them grief whores. They're the people that show up, because my daughter's accident, like, it was in the news and whatever, so."
Sure.
And then there were the people who climbed out of the woodwork, and I barely knew them and wasn't really, like, friends per se with them, but then all of a sudden, they acted like they were my best friend, and then they would start, like, posting stuff about me and my daughter and whatever on social media. So like people would, acting like we were so close.
Yeah.
So people would feel sorry for them.
Like,
And I'm like,
almost hijacking your emotional
yes,
experience of that.
that's
You're like, "I didn't
exactly.
ask you to do that. I don't even know who you
Yeah. And I'm
are."
like, what, who
Yeah.
are you? Yeah. So those were I never knew people were like that, until it happened to me. And I just thought grief horror was the funniest name for it. But I love, like, the practical that you offer actual practical advice for how to deal with the different people, because I found it's one of the stickiest and most difficult things, I think, for grievers is
Mhm.
navigating the relationships, and I think it's so important to just be honest with people. Like, I am hugely introverted, but you still want people to reach out.
Yeah.
And you know that every now and then you need to do something. So I've personally found it so helpful, and I share with people to kind of similar to what you said. Like, if I don't respond, like, check back in later. Don't stop. Like, don't disappear.
Yeah.
Just I appreciate the effort. Just don't be surprised if, if I cancel our plans or whatever. So much I think of being a friend of someone who's grieving is just not giving up, know,
Right,
and not
it's a persistence, but kind of a
yes.
quiet one.
Yeah.
It's not alarm clocky, it's kind of just like drop a letter in the mail slot
Yes, it's
sort of
like, "I'm
persistence.
here. I'm thinking
Mhm,
about you. You don't necessarily have to respond. I just want you to know that I'm there." That means so
yeah.
much, I think, to people who are grieving.
That's
Yeah.
exactly, what I'm writing about in my next book.
Ah,
It's not a book for grievers, it is a book for people who are adjacent to people who are grieving,
yeah,
and the entire second section is about how to remind people that you're present and you're here, but there's no obligation to respond or reach out. Um, but how much it matters. And I'm including a bunch of like client stories and language
yeah,
examples and script examples of how to reach out to grieving people. Because people are like, I want to be there for somebody, but they say things like, let me know if there's anything I can do. And I'm like, well, now it's my job to think of a task for you. And I don't have one.
yeah, yeah,
Or if I'm like, well, I actually need somebody to come over and paint my foyer because we're moving out soon and I got to get my deposit back. Like, what if they say no and then they coordinate it with somebody else? Or what if they do it anyway because they don't feel like saying no and then they do a bad job? Or then they feel like they have to do it because I asked that. There's so many questions.
yeah.
And so I'm like, how can we make language easy for people who are supporting grieving people and make it clear enough that people who are grieving can say that feels like support. And this comes from,
Yes.
8 years of working with grieving people and seeing this language work in session with people, but then also in the real world. And I'm so excited to just, like, bring this book to
Oh, I
shelves.
can't
I'm
wait.
so
That is
thrilled.
gonna
I
be
love that you brought that
amazing.
up. That's, like, the perfect segue.
Honestly, that I feel like my I mean, I feel like people need it. People
Mhm.
need that. Honestly, I just looked at this. My highest performing YouTube video is exactly that topic. It's about,
Yeah.
what to say or what to do if you have a friend who's grieving, and that's the number one thing that people look for
Yep.
in my videos. So I feel like there's such a need for that. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading what you come up with. That is awesome.
I can't
Yeah.
wait.
Yeah, very cool. So you have a lot of stuff going on. I know we're we're kind of getting to our time here, and I want to make sure that you can talk about a lot of the stuff. I kind of want to start with the podcasting because, like I said, like your podcast, you've done multiple podcasts. I feel like it was Grief Seeds that was the one that I
Mhm.
absolutely loved, but you've had like a couple iterations of different podcasts. Can you kind of take us through because you really started podcasting, I feel like, before podcasting was cool and everyone was doing it.
That's so funny.
So, can you talk about kind of how you got into podcasting and then like the different versions of podcasts because you have a new one, I believe, starting pretty soon, right?
Yeah, I sure do.
Okay.
I started, doing grief work in 2016, so about 3 years after my mom died, and the wildest thing happened. I went to, like, this meetup for coaches in Chicago, and there are a bunch of us from different types of coaching. There were financial
Yeah.
coaches and spirituality coaches and physical therapy coaches. And they're just kind of like every flavor of coach you can possibly imagine was all together in a room. And it was a totally separate, non-grief related workshop. And this woman crosses the room and comes to me and she's like, I don't know how else to tell you this, but I just like have a message for you of like whatever's happening in your coaching, you need to use your voice. And I was like, okay, that was a clear enough sign, thank you very much. And I'd been listening to podcasts kind of again, like we talked about earlier, I could not read after my mother's death.
Yeah.
I, started reading again, I think about a year to 2 years after she died. I got my first Chicago library card, and that kind of unlocked a world of, "Oh, there are other people writing and talking about grief," which I did not know.
Yeah.
Or I wasn't able to see after death, like, people, like, would drop off books and stuff to the house, but at that point, it just felt like homework, and I was
Right.
like, "I don't you're giving me homework in a casserole, why am I excited about that?" I was actually kind of offended. I was like, "I'm already in college, why are you giving me more to do?" By handing me a book, and so I didn't touch books for a couple years after my mom died, and so the things that I reached for the most were podcasts, and I think one of the first ones I discovered was Dear Sugars by Cheryl Strayed,
Mhm.
who
Yep.
wrote the book Wild, which is a memoir of mother loss, and so I kind of just, like, naturally floated into podcast world.
Yeah.
And after this person approached me and said, "You need to use your voice," and I had been doing Facebook Lives for a while, similar to this, all by myself. Um, I was like, well, it was kind of like, how hard can it be? I was like, how hard can it be to start a podcast? As you probably know, it's a little bit harder than people give you credit for,
Yep.
or people give it credit for. It's like, how hard can it be? You buy a mic and you start talking. I'm like, yes, but there's more to it than that. So the first show I created was in May of 2017. It was called Coming Back:
Mhm.
Conversations on Life After Loss, and it was. And still is the most popular podcast I've produced to date. It was
Mhm.
mostly an interview show where I'd have people on, um, like you, and we talk about living life with grief, but also kind of books people were putting out into the world or niche topics related to grief. To your point of like, what's the highest watched or viewed thing that people are seeking out? My number one episode of that, and still my highest rated YouTube video or highest
Mhm.
watched YouTube video with like more than 20,000 views, is about grief and sex
Oh,
and
okay.
how we have sex if we have sex after somebody we love dies. Whether we lose a partner, because that's a
Yeah.
different discussion, or we just lose somebody we love and we're looking for physical connection, we're looking for comfort, or we're like, shut it down, I feel nothing through my body right now. And so we're kind of just exploring all the different ways the connection between grief and sex happens. But I did get to talk to Cheryl Strayed on that podcast,
Mhm.
and people like Megan Devine and Alua Arthur, who's a death doula, and Rob Bell, who wrote a really cool book about spirituality and grief. But so I got to talk to a lot of really neat people, and I ended that in December of 2020. Kind of because COVID really really took it out of me,
Yeah.
and I was doing some other stuff. I was working on some other books, and then the 2 podcasts that followed immediately after that, I released them at the same time. One was called Grief Seeds, which is the one you found me through, and the other one was called Grief Book Roundup. And Grief Book Roundup was a very short 10-minute show where I talked about grief books I loved, and I'd review them in 3 words or less,
Mhm.
and then tell people where they could find them. And I'd read my favorite quotes from the book. And Grief Seeds was a live coaching podcast where I'd go
Cool.
live on Instagram, Facebook, and I believe YouTube every week, I believe every Sunday, and answer a question from people, and just talk people through the experience of what it is to grieve, or if there was nobody online, share a tool that I'd created to um, move through the experience of grief without it feeling too big or too hard. I noticed that a lot of tools I create for grief are not just funny, they're small. And so they're things that can be easily remembered. They're often related to words because I don't want
Yeah.
you to have to pull out a journal. I don't want you to have to stop driving your car. I don't want you to have to feel like you have to buy or acquire something in order to survive
Yeah.
grief. I'm like, you're already doing the work of grief simply by being alive. Why do you need more than that?
Yeah.
Here's just some words or some reframes to change perhaps the way you're seeing your relationship to grief and bring some calm and grounding with that. And both of those podcasts were launched in 2022 around the same time, and I abruptly ended them after my best friend died from COVID.
Mhm.
So I was like, I have never ended something that quickly before, and so
Yeah.
it felt really weird. Talking to your point of how much do you share online, I was like, everything shut down, like everything
Yeah.
came to a screeching halt, um, and I really took a fair bit of time, about 2 years away from actively creating and pushing things out into the world to be present to all the ways that grief was showing up in my life. It was an energy zap. I also got diagnosed with a chronic illness around that time, and so, like, figuring out who I was with that and grieving the
Yeah.
health of a body, and my hair fell out, like, there was a lot of things that were happening, um, around that time, and then just this last year in 2023, I launched on the 10-year anniversary of my mom's
Mhm.
death, December 26th, she died the day after Christmas, a podcast called Dear Grief Guide, in the spirit of Dear Sugars. And
Yep.
so people would write in anonymous letters and sign them, you know, "Grieving in Georgia," or "Not sure and not certain," and I'd say, "Hello, not sure and not certain. I read your letter." Kind of very similar to Dear Prudence or Dear Abby that you'd read in the newspaper.
Yep.
They were my favorite newspaper columns growing up, but also similar to Dear Sugars, and it's just it was 25 minutes or less, a direct response to a letter, but also, even if the letter didn't apply to you or you hadn't experienced the same loss, you could gain something from
Yeah.
having listened to it.
Definitely.
Um, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Podcasting life, also, you're talking all
Yeah.
the time. And then the next podcast, and kind of what I hope will be my last podcast, because 'cause I'm tired of creating new ones, um, is called Grief Grower, and it's coming out this Thursday, March 20th, on the spring equinox. I love picking meaningful dates for things, and so, like, having the calendar, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, turn to spring feels really meaningful to
Yeah.
me. But even in my first podcast and when I first started doing grief work, I would refer to my community as grief growers.
Mm.
And I closed out every podcast, and I'm sure you've heard this before, with even
Yep.
through grief, we are growing.
Yep.
And it's not that, and I'll say this in the first episode of this new show, it's not that grief is a self improvement project, because I don't believe it is. And I actually really hate when people treat it like one. It's like, just take a workshop, just read a book, just improve your
Yeah.
life. And then, you'll learn how to live life with grief,
Yes.
but it doesn't work like that. The intention of that statement, even through grief we are growing, is even when we can't see it or feel it or know it, it is happening. There are things that are moving you forward by sheer fact that you are alive and you are here and you have experienced a loss and you are getting through another day. You are growing through grief. And then the being able to visibly see it and know it and understand it and give it credit, that's something that comes with time, but also with the tools to see it, kind of like the grief
Yeah.
classes, or tallying your secondary losses, or noticing which toxic grief tropes your friends and family are. So this podcast is going to be made up of everything I've done before. And so it's going
Cool.
to be interviews, it's going to be solo episodes where I give tools and tell stories
Yeah.
and do some coaching. It's going to be anonymous letters that people can still submit, because people really seem to like that format from Dear
Yeah.
Grief Guide, is like, I
Right.
want to write to you, I want my problem solved, but I don't want you to know who I am, which is very fair. When you're grieving, a lot of
Yeah.
people don't want their stuff out there. And a lot of times they're like, can you change the gender? Can you anonymize this in another way so that I still get my question answered, but it's not to tell all of
Right.
my life. And it's also going to be talks with authors and book reviews, because I so much love the fact that there are books in the world for grief, and especially now that audiobooks are so big. It's
Yeah.
practically the only way I read books is listening to audiobooks. I read a few in print. But so this podcast, Grief Grower, is all intended for people who know, like, deep in their bones, I'm not meant to get over grief. Grief is
Yeah.
not a thing to be gotten over. It is a thing to be grown through and with and around and alongside. And there are conversations and tools and guidance that help you do all of that. But it kind of will pick from a constellation of ways to do that. Some
Yeah.
people like interviews, some people like books, some people like letter answering, some people like, listicles. 5 ways to support somebody who's grieving, for example, would be a good episode for this podcast. But I'm really thrilled to kind of bring it all together. My goal, the older I get in doing grief work and in existing in the world, the more I don't necessarily want to create just like one-off things for here and there that are temporary. Like, I'm thinking Instagram Reels or like TikToks and
Right.
stuff. For as much as
Yeah.
I love social media, I really do. Um,
You are very good at it, I will say.
I really like doing it. But something I hear from so many people I work with is they love having access to what feels like a library of
Mhm.
resources and topics when they're grieving. And so in my mind, Grief Grower is going to operate like a grand sort of catch-all library for all things grief. We'll talk about grief and sex, we'll talk about the early days, we'll talk about 20
Yeah.
years later, we'll talk about government and politics and policy, we'll talk about the latest books that have just come out with regard to grief, and books that have been on the shelves for 20 years that may be having
Yeah.
an anniversary coming up. So I'm really thrilled to kind of bring everything all together. And this is a sort of growth for me, because I usually kind of box podcasts into one
Mhm.
format and expect them to stay that way, and demand that they stay that way. And so to give it the freedom to be whatever it needs
With
to be, and
everything.
whoever needs to be on, and whatever needs to be talked about, um, especially right now as the world is very actively grieving and finding new things to grieve every single day,
Yeah.
I am just so thrilled for how this is going to show up in the world.
Oh, I can't wait to listen. It sounds amazing. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
listened to all your different podcasts before, and if nothing else, if nothing else, people can fall asleep to the sound of your voice.
Yes. You sure can, and I will not be offended. I will
No,
not be
I think
offended
I
at
think I
all.
even say in my book, like, I was like, "Her voice is like butter."
That, people are like, you never know what tools you gain in your childhood or your early
Yeah.
jobs that will be useful to you. I took voice lessons and was in musical theater and a cappella groups for like the first 15, 18 years of my life.
Yep.
And I'll tell you, it has paid off in
It is
spades.
paid off. That's amazing. Well, Shelby, my book is on audiobook, so if you wanna listen, I'd be happy
Yay!
to you can find it on Audible. Yeah, but oh my gosh, I'm so excited to listen, and I think that people will love your podcast. Where can they find you? Because we're kind of out of time here, so if you could tell people where's the best place to find all of these amazing things that you're doing.
Yeah, I'll give you one because grief
Okay,
brain is real. shelbyforsythia.com
okay,
slash links. That's it.
perfect.
There's
All
a
right, and
quiz
I will
there, there's books there, there's free workshops there. There's a bunch of stuff to explore there, but you can kind of just
awesome.
choose your own adventure.
Perfect. I will put that in the description. So if you're watching this on the replay, it will be in the description for you to find all of the amazing things that Shelby is doing. And I can't wait to hear the podcast. So the first episode drops this Thursday.
Yeah, it sure does. And thank you
Cool.
for giving me an excuse to look cute. I'm recording some early
Yeah,
episodes today.
of course. Glad I could help. Oh my goodness. Well, Shelby, it was such an honor to talk to you. Thank you for helping me with my grief and thank you for all of the people that you've helped along the way and for sharing your own experiences with us. I really appreciate everything you do. And thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Brooke. I'm so glad to have met you, and cheers to still
Yeah, of
being
course.
here and
Yes,
doing
yes,
well with everything.
cheers. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us on the Mourning Coffee Podcast, and we will see you next time. Bye.